The dust never settled in Texas during wartime, constantly stirred by truck convoys, cattle movements, and the relentless wind that swept across plains so vast they seemed to mock any attempt at containment. When Lieselot Meinhardt first saw those planes through the slats of a transport truck in 1944, she experienced not relief but deeper confusion. Everything she'd been prepared for, the brutality, the degradation, the systematic cruelty, was conspicuously absent, replaced by something far more disorienting, normalcy bordering on hospitality. The propaganda Lisa had absorbed for years hadn't been subtle. American captivity meant torture, starvation, forced labor until death. The stories were specific enough to seem credible. Prisoners worked in mines until their lungs gave out. Women were subjected to horrors too terrible to name explicitly. Food was rotten when it existed at all. These weren't whispered rumors, but official warnings from Luftwaffe officers who claimed to have intelligence from front. Lisa had believed them completely, because why would your own commanders lie about something so consequential? So when that cowboy, an actual cowboy, not a guard in uniform but a rancher in work clothes, handed her cold, clean water and told her to watch her step, her first instinct was suspicion. This must be the trick before the trap. The kindness was performance, theatrical cruelty designed to make the real punishment more devastating when it arrived. She drank the water but watched for the moment when masks would drop and true intentions would reveal themselves. That moment never came. Days passed, then weeks, and the performance never ended because it wasn't performance. The work was real, feeding livestock, mending fences, maintaining equipment. But it was work, not punishment disguised as labor. The difference was profound but initially incomprehensible to someone trained to see work as either duty to the state or suffering imposed by enemies. Here work was simply what needed doing, compensated with fair treatment, and steady meals that shocked by their abundance and consistency. The psychological adjustment required was more difficult than any physical labor. Lisa had been raised in a system where authority meant domination, where strength was demonstrated through subordination of others, where kindness was weakness and trust was foolishness. The Texas ranchers operated from completely different assumptions. Their authority came from competence and respect rather than fear. They gave orders expecting cooperation rather than demanding obedience. When mistakes happened, and they happened constantly as German women learned unfamiliar tasks, the response was patient instruction rather than punishment or humiliation. Frank Callahan embodied this alien philosophy so completely that Lisa initially couldn't categorize him. He wasn't soft or permissive. He expected work to be done properly and would correct errors firmly. But his corrections focused on the task rather than the person, on fixing problems rather than assigning blame. When Lisa struggled with a stubborn horse, Frank didn't criticize her incompetence. He showed her different techniques, explained the animal's perspective, waited while she tried again. The horse eventually cooperated not because it had been beaten into submission, but because Lisa had learned to work with it rather than against it. The other women experienced similar disorientation. They gathered in the evenings comparing observations, trying to construct a framework that made sense of their situation. Anna insisted the Americans must want something. This level of treatment had to be manipulation toward some end. Maria suggested they were being studied, experimental subjects in some psychological research. But as weeks became months without any hidden agenda revealing itself, these theories collapsed under the weight of accumulating kindness that seemed to expect nothing in return except honest work. The breaking point for Lisa came during a thunderstorm when cattle panicked and scattered. Without thinking, she mounted her horse and rode alongside the cowboys to gather the herd. The rain was blinding, the lightning terrifying, the cattle dangerous in their fear. For hours, she worked with single-minded focus on preventing disaster, moving as part of a team where her status as prisoner was irrelevant compared to her ability to handle a horse and think quickly under pressure. When they finally returned, exhausted and drenched, Frank surveyed the intact herd and said simply, "Good work." Not good work for a prisoner, or good work for a woman, or good work considering. Just recognition that she had performed competently when it mattered. That night, staring at the hand-painted sign designating them German cowgirls, Lisa felt something shift fundamentally in her understanding of the world. The sign was affectionate rather than mocking. inclusion rather than othering. She had earned respect through demonstrated capability, and that respect was freely given without requiring her to abandon identity or grovel for acceptance. The letters home created their own crisis of belief. When Lisa wrote describing her life, the food, the work, the horses, the trust, she knew it sounded impossible. Her mother's reply confirmed this. "You must be mistaken. Perhaps you're dreaming." They would never treat prisoners so well. The disconnect between Lisa's lived experience and her family's understanding of reality created a kind of vertigo. She was living proof that everything they'd been taught about America was wrong, but she had no way to make them believe her because the truth was too far outside their conceptual framework. Other women received similar responses. Their families, still enduring bombing raids and severe rationing, couldn't reconcile tales of abundance and kindness with their understanding of how war worked. Some accused their daughters of being brainwashed or having lost their minds. A few suggested the letters were forgeries created by American propaganda. The irony was profound. The real propaganda had been what they'd received from their own government, but that propaganda was so deeply embedded it made truth seem like lies. The male POWs who arrived later provided external validation. They watched in stunned silence as the women rode across open pastures, laughing and trading jokes with cowboys in a mixture of broken English and German. One soldier muttered, "Das kann nicht echt sein," this cannot be real, expressing the cognitive dissonance they all felt. Everything in their training insisted the scenario was impossible. Enemy captors didn't trust prisoners with horses and freedom of movement. They didn't share meals or teach skills or treat captivity as temporary employment rather than punishment. But it was real, and reality gradually reshaped their understanding of what was possible. The cowboys taught them to rope cattle, to repair tack, eventually even to dance. By November, the ranch had become something that shouldn't have existed, a space where former enemies worked alongside each other with mutual respect, where nationality mattered less than competence and character, where the war seemed like something happening on a different planet. Frank never articulated any grand philosophy. His approach was purely pragmatic. War is over for you when you get here. Ain't no use fighting ghosts. But that pragmatism contained within it a profound moral confidence. America didn't need to humiliate its captives to prove its strength. It could afford to be decent because its power was secure enough that it didn't require constant demonstration through domination. This confidence was so foreign to Lisa's experience that it took months for her to fully recognize and understand it. When victory in Europe was announced, the reaction among the women wasn't celebration, but stunned disorientation. The war had structured every aspect of their lives for years. Now it was simply over, ended not through their participation, but while they were removed from entirely. Home became a word without clear meaning. What did it mean to return home when home had been bombed into rubble, when families might be dead or displaced, when the political system that had defined their identity had been destroyed? The preparation for repatriation forced them to confront what they'd learned and what it meant. Frank's gift of a Stetson to Lisa wasn't just a souvenir. It was tangible proof that her experience had been real, that the kindness had happened, that she hadn't imagined or dreamed the transformation in her understanding of the world. She wore on the journey back, a visible symbol of something that couldn't easily be explained but had fundamentally changed her. The Germany Lisa returned to was physically destroyed, but also morally exhausted. People were too focused on survival to maintain the ideological certainties that had sustained them during the war. In that environment, her stories about Texas found receptive audiences. People wanted to believe that decency had survived somewhere, that not everything had been corrupted by 6 years of industrialized death. Her account of cowboys who treated enemies with respect provided hope that reconstruction might be possible, not just of buildings, but of human relationships. Working as a translator for Allied occupation forces, Lisa became a bridge between worlds. Her English, learned from ranch hands, was colloquial and full of Americanisms that amused officers, but also marked her as someone who had experienced America directly rather than through formal education or propaganda. She could explain American thinking to Germans and German thinking to Americans because she had lived in both worlds and seen their contradictions and commonalities. The women's conference in Stuttgart where Lisa spoke represented a kind of testimony. She stood before former enemies and described not suffering but transformation, not cruelty but unexpected kindness. Her message wasn't that war was acceptable or that Germany's defeat was unjust. It was simpler and more profound. People on both sides were capable of decency if circumstances allowed it, and rebuilding required recognizing that capability rather than insisting on permanent enmity. Her eventual immigration to San Antonio was a nostalgic return to a happy memory. It was a deliberate choice to live in a place that had shown her a different way of being in the world. The bakery she opened became a physical space where German traditions and American culture merged, creating something new that honored both rather than requiring choice between them. The framed photograph of herself in an oversized Stetson standing beside Frank wasn't merely personal keepsake, but statement about possibility. That enemies had become friends, that trust would be rebuilt, that kindness could survive even war's attempts to destroy it. By the time Lisa died, she had witnessed not just her own transformation, but the broader reconciliation between Germany and America. Thousands of former POWs returned home with similar stories of fair treatment that contradicted everything they'd been taught. These stories circulated through communities, gradually replacing propaganda with lived experience. They didn't erase what had happened during the war or excuse the crimes committed in Germany's name, but they provided foundation for moving forward rather than remaining trapped in cycles of revenge and recrimination. Historians studying post-war Reconstruction often focus on Marshall Plan aid or political institutions, but the human connections formed through unexpected decency played their own crucial role. When Frank Callahan treated Lisa not as enemy prisoner, but as person deserving respect, he wasn't implementing policy or following orders. He was simply acting according to his own values, unaware that his actions would ripple outward through her life and the lives she touched afterward. The greatest victories aren't always won on battlefields. Sometimes they're earned in quiet moments of choosing kindness over cruelty, trust over suspicion, common humanity over tribal identity. On a Texas ranch in 1944, ordinary people demonstrated that even in the middle of history's most destructive war, decency could survive and even flourish. That demonstration changed lives, including Lisa's, and through those changed lives contributed to rebuilding a world that had nearly destroyed itself. The dust may never fully settle in Texas, but the lessons learned are settled deep in the hearts of those who experienced them, becoming foundation for peace that outlasted a war that had seemed endless. The decades that followed revealed dimensions of Lisa's experience that she couldn't have understood while living through them. What had seemed like isolated kindness on a Texas ranch was actually part of a larger American calculation about how to win not just a war, but the peace that would follow. The United States held over 400,000 Axis prisoners during the conflict, and the decision to treat them humanely wasn't primarily humanitarian. It was strategic. A well-treated prisoner who returned home with positive impressions of America became an asset in the ideological competition that everyone knew was coming after military victory. But strategy and genuine decency aren't mutually exclusive, and Lisa came to understand that the Cowboys who treated her well weren't implementing policy, but expressing character. Frank Callahan hadn't read briefings about psychological warfare or post-war planning. He simply treated people the way his own values dictated, and those values happened to align with larger strategic interests. The authenticity of his kindness was what made it effective. You can't fake the kind of patient instruction he provided when teaching her to handle horses, the genuine concern he showed when she struggled, the respect he offered when she succeeded. The other women who shared her experience processed it differently based on their own backgrounds and personalities. Anna, who had been more skeptical initially, never fully trusted the Americans even after months of fair treatment. She returned to Germany convinced that she'd been manipulated somehow, that the kindness had been calculated performance designed to weaken German resolve. Maria developed a kind of survivor's guilt, feeling that she lived too comfortably while others suffered in actual combat or genuine prison camps. Some women spoke freely about their time in Texas. Others rarely mentioned it, as if the experience was too complicated or too personal to share. Lisa chose a different path. She made her Texas experience central to her identity, not because she was naive about American motives or blind to America's own contradictions and failures, but because she'd witnessed something important about human possibility. In a world consumed by hatred and violence, she'd found a space where different rules applied. That space was temporary and geographically limited, but it was real. And if it could exist on a Texas ranch in 1944, perhaps it could exist elsewhere if people chose to create it. Her bakery in San Antonio became more than just a business. It evolved into an informal gathering place for anyone interested in reconciliation, understanding, and the complicated work of moving past enmity. Former POWs visited, sharing their own stories of captivity that ranged from harsh to surprisingly comfortable. American veterans stopped in, curious about the German perspective, and often surprised to find common ground with former enemies. Younger Germans who'd immigrated after the war came seeking connection to others who understood the complexity of German identity after national catastrophe. Lisa never minimized what Germany had done. She didn't retreat into claims that ordinary Germans hadn't known about the camps or hadn't supported the regime. She acknowledged her own participation in the war effort, however peripheral, and the ways she believed propaganda that should have been questioned. But she also insisted that acknowledging guilt didn't require accepting permanent shame or eternal enmity. People and nations could learn, change, grow beyond their worst moments if given opportunity, and if they did the difficult work of honest reckoning. The conversations in her bakery often turned to questions about how reconciliation actually happens. The formal mechanisms, treaties, reparations, war crimes trials, were important but insufficient. Real reconciliation required millions of individual choices to see former enemies as human beings rather than abstractions. It required vulnerability, the willingness to have your assumptions challenged and your worldview disrupted. It required patience, because understanding develops slowly through accumulated interactions rather than single revelations. Lisa's relationship with Frank continued through letters over the years. They were never romantic. Frank was married with children, and their connection was based on mutual respect rather than personal attraction. But they maintained correspondence that evolved from simple updates about daily life into deeper discussions about memory, forgiveness, and what the war had meant. Frank wrote about his own struggles to reconcile his Christian faith with killing he'd done in combat. Lisa wrote about the difficulty of explaining to younger Germans what life under the Nazi regime had actually felt like from inside it. These letters, preserved in a small archive that developed after Lisa's death, provide remarkable insight into how ordinary people processed extraordinary times. Frank wasn't a philosopher or theologian, but his reflections on violence and morality showed a man genuinely wrestling with hard questions. Lisa wasn't a historian or political scientist, but her attempts to explain how propaganda works and how ordinary people convince themselves to support terrible things demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. When Frank died in 1972, Lisa traveled to Texas for the funeral. It was her first return since leaving in 1945, and the landscape hit her with unexpected emotional force. The ranch had changed, more modern equipment, different buildings, even the windmill had been replaced. But the essential character remained. The open sky, the quality of light, the sense of space that had seemed so alien and has now felt like a kind of homecoming. She stood at Frank's grave and thought about the randomness of it all, that she'd been assigned his ranch rather than some other facility, that he'd been the kind of man who treated prisoners with decency, that this accident of wartime logistics had shaped the entire trajectory of her life. The funeral brought together people whose connections trace back to those wartime years. Cowboys now in their 60s and 70s who remember the German women prisoners. A few other former POWs who'd settled in America and maintained contact. American veterans who become friends with Frank after the war. The gathering wasn't about celebrating the war or minimizing its horrors. It was about acknowledging that even in the middle of catastrophe, there had been moments of grace that deserved recognition and gratitude. Lisa was asked to speak at the service. She stood before the assembled mourners and told the story of her first day at the ranch, her fear, her confusion, her gradual recognition that she wasn't being tricked, but genuinely welcomed into a community that measured worth by work and character rather than nationality. She described Frank's patient teaching, his quiet dignity, his refusal to treat captured enemies as less than human, and she said something that surprised even herself. Frank saved my life not by preventing death, but by showing me how to live after everything I believed proved false. That phrase, how to live after everything proved false, resonated with many people in the room, because it captured something universal about post-war experience. German society had to rebuild after the Nazi ideology collapsed. American society had to reckon with the violence they'd committed, even in a justified cause. Everyone involved had to find ways to move forward, carrying the weight of what had happened, but not crushed entirely by that weight. Frank's example showed one way forward: honest work, genuine relationships, and the patient construction of meaning from whatever materials remained available. In the 1980s, as Lisa aged and her health declined, she became involved in oral history projects documenting POW experiences. Researchers were finally paying attention to these stories, recognizing that they revealed important dimensions of the war and its aftermath that had been overlooked in more traditional military and political histories. Lisa gave extensive interviews, describing not just events but her internal experience: the fear, the confusion, the gradual transformation in understanding, the ongoing struggle to integrate contradictory experiences into coherent identity. What emerged from these interviews was a portrait of someone profoundly changed by encounter with a culture radically different from her own. The Texas ranchers hadn't converted her to American ideology or made her reject her German identity. Instead, they'd shown her that her assumptions about how authority worked, how strangers should be treated, and what gave life meaning were culturally specific rather than universal truths. This recognition was simultaneously liberating and destabilizing. If the truths she'd been raised with weren't universal, then she had to figure out which principles to keep, which to discard, and how to construct a framework for living that honored multiple perspectives. Her grandson, interviewing her near the end of her life, asked whether she'd forgiven Germany for what had happened. Lisa thought for a long time before answering. "Forgiveness implies judgment from a position of innocence," she finally said. "I was part of it, even in small ways. I believed the propaganda. I did my work for the war effort. I didn't resist. So I can't forgive Germany as if I were separate from it. What I can do is acknowledge what happened, understand how it happened, and spend my life trying to prevent it from happening again. That's not forgiveness. It's responsibility." She had similar complicated feelings about America. She was deeply grateful for the treatment she'd received as a prisoner and for the opportunities America had given her afterward. But she'd also learned about American racism, about the Japanese internment camps, about the violence inflicted on Native Americans and the exploitation of immigrant labor. The same country that had treated her with unexpected decency had its own profound moral failures. Rather than trying to decide which was a real America, she came to see both as real, the capacity for kindness and the capacity for cruelty coexisting in the same society, sometimes in the same individuals. This nuanced understanding made her skeptical of simple narratives about good guys and bad guys, civilized nations and barbaric ones. She'd lived through the collapse of one set of certainties and wasn't interested in replacing it with another equally rigid framework. Instead, she embraced complexity, tried to see people and nations in their full contradiction, capable of both terrible cruelty and surprising kindness, shaped by circumstances but not entirely determined by them, carrying responsibility for choices while also operating within constraints they didn't choose. The bakery changed hands after Lisa's death, sold to a family who maintained the name and much of the original menu as tribute to her. The photograph of her in the oversized Stetson remained on the wall, but new photos joined it. Pictures of the multiple generations who'd gathered in that space, former enemies who become friends, strangers who become community. The physical space continued serving its function as gathering place even after its founder was gone, suggesting that what she'd built had achieved a kind of self-sustaining momentum. Historians studying German-American reconciliation eventually recognized Lisa and others like her as crucial but often overlooked actors in that process. The Marshall Plan and NATO mattered enormously, but so did the thousands of personal connections formed through unexpected kindness during and after the war. These connections created networks of goodwill and mutual understanding that made official reconciliation possible by providing human foundation for political agreements. Treaties work best when populations are prepared to accept them, and that preparation often happens through individual relationships rather than government pronouncements. The Texas ranch where Lisa worked was never designated a historical site or marked with plaques. It continued operating as a working ranch. The buildings where she'd lived replaced multiple times as they aged and new needs emerged. But the land itself remained, the same wide sky and rolling plains that seemed so impossibly vast to a young German woman encountering them for the first time. The physical continuity provided anchor for memory even as everything else changed. When scholars finally tracked down the ranch decades later to interview Frank's descendants, they found a family that had absorbed Lisa's story into their own history. Frank's grandchildren had grown up hearing about the German women prisoners who'd worked alongside their grandfather, about the unusual circumstances of wartime labor programs, about relationships that had crossed enemy lines and lasted decades afterward. For them, it wasn't history in the distant sense, but part of their family narrative, proof that their grandfather had been someone worth remembering and emulating. The lesson Lisa drew from her experience and spent her life sharing wasn't complicated or esoteric. People are shaped by circumstances, but retain agency within those circumstances. Choosing kindness over cruelty is always possible, even when systems encourage the opposite. Trust has to be earned, but can be earned even across lines of enmity. Forgiveness is complicated and often impossible. But moving forward together despite unresolved pain is necessary if humanity is to survive its own worst impulses. She never claimed her experience was typical or that other POWs had similar stories. Many prisoners in many places were treated far worse, and she acknowledged her good fortune in being assigned to a place where decency prevailed. But she insisted that even exceptional experiences revealed something true about possibility. If kindness could exist in her case, it could exist in others. The question was whether human nature made kindness possible. Her experience proved it was, but rather what circumstances made it more or less likely and how those circumstances could be created or encouraged. The dust in Texas continues its endless stirring, carried by winds that recognize no borders and acknowledge no human divisions. The land endures long after the people who worked have gone, holding their stories in silence until someone comes looking for them. Lisa's story survived through her own telling, through letters and interviews and the memories of people whose lives she touched. But it also survived in the physical space of the bakery, in the continuing operation of the ranch, in the ongoing work of reconciliation between nations that once tried to destroy each other. Sometimes history's most important moments aren't the ones that make headlines or get commemorated with monuments. Sometimes they're quiet interactions between ordinary people who choose, in circumstances that would excuse cruelty, to offer kindness instead. Frank Callahan handing a cup of cold water to a frightened prisoner was such a moment. Small, easily overlooked, but carrying within it the seed of transformation that would grow across decades and influence countless lives. That's not the heroism of battlefield courage or political vision. It's something quieter but equally necessary. The heroism of treating people as human beings even when systems define them as enemies. Without that quiet heroism, repeated in countless small interactions, the grand gestures of reconciliation would have no foundation to build on.